Good evening to you. I'm Brian McElhatton from ABC 21 in Fort Wayne, and welcome to our U.S. Senate debate tonight, live from the Ramada Plaza Hotel and Convention Center in the city on Three Rivers. Our candidates are on the stage right now, but we're going to get to them in just a moment. They, of course, are vying for your vote for the May 8th primary. The winner of that contest will go on to challenge the incumbent Democrat Senator Joe Donnelly. Before we get to them, though, I'd like to introduce our panel of journalists. They'll be joining me in asking questions of the candidates tonight, and we'll go in order here, starting with editorial writer Tim Harmon with the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, reporter Kevin Rader with WTHR Channel 13, Indianapolis, Kevin Leininger here reporting for Fort Wayne's NewsSentinel.com, Wayne TV's evening anchor Brett Thomas, and rounding out our panel tonight is evening anchor and newsroom manager Jeff Smith from WLFI News 18 in Lafayette. And of course, moderating our panel tonight is Pat Miller with WOWO Radio. He's here now to introduce the candidates.
Brian, thanks. Good evening, everybody, and to all of you here in the room and to all of you watching at home. On behalf of Chairman Steve Shine, the Allen County Republican Party is very proud to be sponsoring this very important debate that's coming to you live tonight from the Ramada Plaza Hotel and Conference Center here in Fort Wayne. Tonight, in response to the questions from our panelists, each candidate will have 60 seconds to respond to the questions. We will rotate between the candidates as to whom will have the first opportunity to answer each question. Should the moderator determine that a candidate's response warrants a comeback response from another candidate, a 30-second rebuttal will be allowed, but only one. In order to present as many questions as possible, there will be no opening or closing statements. However, I will read something that has been given to me from each of the campaigns, and that's opening statements on their behalf. Tonight, we will cover school safety and gun safety, foreign policy. We will cover the opioid crisis here in the Hoosier State, and we will also talk about how important it is or what it would look like if continued control happens with the Republicans in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. Let me begin, and I will begin with the candidate from the far end and come this way. First up is Todd Rokita. He is the conservative, pro-Trump choice for U.S. Senate, who is fighting to defeat the failed policies of the Washington elite, so all Hoosiers have the freedom and opportunity to build better lives for themselves and their families. Todd and his wife, Kathy, are raising two young boys, Teddy and Ryan, in Brownsburg, Indiana. Next is Luke Messer, a family man and conservative who's running to fix the broken Senate and pass President Trump's agenda. Luke grew up in Greensburg, Indiana, raised by a single mom who worked at the Delta Faucet factory. In Congress, Luke has worked with the president to cut taxes, end tax credits for illegal immigrants, build the wall, fund our troops, and restore veterans' benefits. Luke has a 100% pro-life voting record and an A rating from the NRA. Luke and his wife Jennifer have 3 children, and Luke is coach for his kids' sports teams. And finally, Mike Braun. Mike is running because Hoosiers are ready for leaders who can break the stranglehold career politicians have on control of the federal government and bring true conservative change to Washington. Mike knows that President Trump is going to need reinforcements if he is going to drain the swamp in D.C., and replacing Democrat Senator Joe Donnelly with a true Hoosier conservative who can get the job done is a good place to start. Ladies and gentlemen in the hall, please welcome the candidates this evening. And our first question, which we will start with Mr. Rokita down on the far end. And this first question comes from panelist Tim Harmon from the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. Tim, if you would.
Thank you, Pat. Good evening, gentlemen. After the Valentine's Day shooting at a Florida high school, students in many places, including Fort Wayne, rallied to demand a response to gun violence. What would you say to these students? Do you think there should be more restrictions on the sale or possession of semi-automatic rifles such as the one that was used to kill 4 people and injure 4 others at a restaurant in Tennessee this weekend?
Mr. Rokita.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate those students exercising their First Amendment rights as part of what makes America and this state exceptional. So does the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And the reason we have the right to bear arms is not just for hunting. It's so that we can defend ourselves and our family. And no matter how hard liberals try to say otherwise, the only thing that will ultimately stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I am firmly behind our Second Amendment rights. I have an A rating from the NRA. We have got to make sure school safety is where we put our priorities. And as the kindergarten through 12th grade education chairman in the House of Representatives, we have focused on school safety, and that's where the focus needs to be, that and mental illness. The best thing we've heard in the state of Indiana, and we're a model for the rest of the nation, is school resource officers. Having that police presence in school is really helpful. And in Parkland, if that resource officer was doing his job, perhaps there wouldn't be the tragedy that we're seeing.
Thank you,
today.
Mr. Rokita. Next, we go to Luke Messer. Same question, sir.
Well, I really appreciate that question. Look, I'm the father of a 14-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 10-year-old that goes to school. And like every other Indiana family, we want to make sure our kids are safe when they do go to school. But I can tell you what I hear when I talk to Second Amendment supporters around the state is they're offended by the idea that we can't somehow look out for the Second Amendment and also protect our kids in schools. You're going to hear me say this a lot tonight, but I am who I say I am. So when I tell you I'm a Second Amendment supporter, I'm proud of my A rating with the NRA, but I'm also proud to have worked with President Trump as one of the lead authors of a school safety bill legislation, the School Safety Act, that will be modeled off of what happened in Southwestern Shelby school system, where they have strong facilities, they coordinate with their local law enforcement, and great training for their teachers and their students. We can look out for Second Amendment rights, and we can protect kids in schools too.
Thank you very much, sir. And finally, to Mike Braun. Same question, sir.
Yeah, serious issue. Every time we see this happen, it gives us all great pause, and I think the reflex on the part of the liberal elite is to always try to infringe upon your Second Right Amendments. I'll never forget the day when I was 10 years old and my dad gave me my first shotgun, a single-shot 20-gauge Stevens, and I think folks in Indiana, look at their gun rights as being sacrosanct because it's right there in the Second Amendment. School security, Indiana leads the way. Thank goodness we're ahead of the game there, and I think that that's going to have to be the primary focus. Wherever there's an inkling of mental illness attached to some of these tragedies, you've got to ferret it out, and you've got to find it before it becomes a tragedy. And I was disappointed in law enforcement, when they were sitting outside the school and didn't pick up on those cues. A lot of things need to be done, and the reaction is always to infringe upon your Second Amendment rights.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, also in the same topic about school and gun safety, we go to Kevin Rader from WTHR in Indianapolis. Kevin?
I think we want to get into the topic a little bit deeper because it's more than just whether you support gun rights. We're going to look at ways we can actually make something happen. One of the discussions is arming teachers. Are you for or against that?
For this, we go first to Mr. Messer.
Kevin, I support that, and here's why. I think what President Trump has talked about is common sense approach that makes sure that highly trained teachers who volunteer to be part of protecting our kids in schools have the opportunity to do that. The other panelists have talked about it, but there are some real questions about what happened in Parkland. I mean, you had a school resource officer that did not act, and there are opportunities to make sure we protect our kids. I tell you, though, we're here today to talk about who should be our next United States Senator. I think this is something that the listeners out there need to know tonight, is that Joe Donnelly talks a good game about supporting your Second Amendment rights, but he supports a leadership team in Washington, people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, who want to take away your gun rights. Listen, we're all heartbroken by what's happening in schools across America, but we cannot allow that to become a reason to take away Second Amendment rights in this country.
Thank you, sir. And finally on this, we go to Mike Braun.
Yeah, this issue, I'd have to agree with Luke on this. So often, it just gets misdirected into the wrong area. And to me, you've got to be steadfast and not let anything start to peck away at your Second Amendment rights. It's a slippery slope. And to me, it is typical of what happens whenever we have this kind of issue. And I'm going to always be steadfast to make sure we find any other solution before that occurs.
Thank you, sir. And to the other end, Mr. Rokita.
Kevin, thanks for the question. I'm going to answer your question. Yes. If it's a local decision, well-trained teachers ought to be able to arm themselves in order to protect the classroom, our best asset, our kids, in a particular environment. The last thing we need is Washington prescribing a one-size-fits-all. My solution in quotes. My work is on the kindergarten through 12th grade subcommittee has been to devolve power back to the states. In fact, the Wall Street Journal called my work on the education subcommittee the biggest transfer of power that it has seen from any bills on any subject in 25 years. That's what we need to keep doing, especially regarding our teachers. One size doesn't fit all, and if a local school board or superintendent or school principal wants that option and the community wants that option, the community ought to have that option. When we wonder about violence in schools, and it is a tragedy, maybe we should look elsewhere. Maybe we should look at mental illness. Maybe we should look at putting God back in our schools. Not a particular faith, but so that kids understand that there's a higher authority and that there's someone who loves them.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it very much. Now we go to Kevin Leininger from the NewsSentinel.com. Mr. Leininger, if you would, sir.
Gentlemen, good evening. We've all heard the sound bites, we've heard the ads, and frankly, the personal attacks. And most Republicans, or many that I talk to, begin to think they all blur together. So my question really transcends gun violence and all issues. What most distinguishes each of you from the other two candidates, not only philosophically and politically, but perhaps more important, as human beings? How do you arrive at a conclusion?
And this time we start with you, Mr. Braun.
Excellent question, because I think that's the defining thing for all of you to figure out in the course of the debates and in the next couple weeks we've got. There's a clear choice here. I've built my life in the real world, in the trenches of conservatism. Over 37 years, I built a business, and believe me, you run into every impediment a bureaucrat or a politician can throw in front of you. So I think that my two opponents have got a record. They've been in politics as their career, and I think that they're going to have to make the case that do we need to send more people from the farm system of politics that have given us the results we're dealing with, from an institution that's got a 15% approval rating? Or do you want somebody like me that's lived about through every possible thing you could encounter and that won't need to be briefed on the issues because I've done it in the real world?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rokita?
Thank you for the question. I am the only one on stage here tonight, and you can also throw Joe Donnelly into that mix, that has never voted to raise your taxes, and I never will. These two, each $1 billion worth of votes to raise your taxes. Raising taxes isn't the answer to everything. The government takes enough from us. The government doesn't have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. We need to send real leadership to the U.S. Senate to hold the line when it comes to raising taxes. We just got tax cuts done. That's the direction we should be going. It's providing more money, more of our property back to us, more jobs and bonuses. I will never raise your taxes and never will, because raising taxes is a problem. I also have a record of accomplishment. As your Secretary of State, we did a lot together. Chief among them is photo identification at the polls. When you elected me, we worked with the legislature, we implemented it, because a lot of the precinct committeemen right here in the room today and across the state, we had a successful election. We became the first in the nation to do that. And now, as I humbly ask for your support for U.S. Senate, 30 states have followed our lead.
Thank you, sir. And now we go to Mr. Messer.
The answer to your question is that I am who I say I am. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son of a single-parent mother. I was raised by my mother, who recently retired from the Delta Faucet factory. I'm a person of faith, and I'm a pro-life, pro-Second Amendment conservative who supports President Trump. That's really important, because the essence of the case we have to make against Joe Donnelly this fall is that Joe Donnelly is not who he says he is. He tells Hoosier conservatives, he tells Hoosiers that he's conservative, and he goes to Washington and votes with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and other liberals 85% of the time. Frankly, the guys I'm running against are not who they say they are. We've got one guy, Mr. Braun, who is a lifetime Democrat, just became a Republican in the last few years. How can we trust him to stand up for conservative Hoosier values in Washington? Mr. Rokita, he runs around the state with a MAGA hat on, and he was just told by the Trump campaign to take down his yard signs because he's been falsely claiming for weeks and months that he has the president's support. I am who I say I am. That's the case we need to be able to take to Joe Donnelly.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your questions and answers. Let's go real quick. I want to change topics here, and we're going to go to foreign policy. We had the Pompeo announcement just moments before the debate. We've talked about bombs, denuclearizing, all kinds of things. Let's get into that, shall we? And for that, we start with WPTA's Brian McElhatton. Brian?
Okay. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. In 2015, the U.S., along with some of its allies, France, Great Britain, Germany, other countries, they made a nuclear deal with Iran. The parties agreed that Iran would freeze its nuclear program in exchange for the lift of sanctions. Well, now, as you know, President Trump is demanding a new deal, a new Iran deal by May 12th, or he says the U.S. will exit that agreement, much to the chagrin of U.S. allies. My question to you, gentlemen, is this. Do you believe the Iran deal needs to be reworked, even if that means upsetting our closest allies?
And for this, we go first to Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for the question. Yes, it needs to be reworked. Joe Donnelly, at the request of President Obama, made sure that the largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranian government, got $150 billion in cash so that they can do quote-unquote economic development. No Hoosier believes that the Iranian government is going to do economic development unless economic development means terrorism. And to them, that's exactly what it means. So now we've found that terrible judgment leading to money being spent in Syria against our interest. And there's even news reports that that money has found its way to North Korea. Another hot spot in this world. So President Trump is exactly right to rework the deal. I support him completely in that effort.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Messer.
The Iran nuclear deal never should have happened in the first place because you've given an evil, desperate regime that was failing economically billions of dollars to bail themselves out. This is another example of where Joe Donnelly's not who he says he is. Joe Donnelly says he looks out for American interests. He says he's a friend of Israel, and yet he signed off because of political pressure from President Obama and others on a terrible nuclear deal with Iran. They're already clear evidence of violations. But I can tell you this, the Hoosiers I talk to as I travel this state, they're excited by President Trump's leadership. They believe that America is safest when America is strong. We may talk about this a little bit later, but you've got North Korea coming to the table talking about disarming their nuclear program because this president has showed strength and stared that evil, desperate North Korean dictator down. I think when President Trump stands up to Iran, you'll get a much better deal, one that maybe actually keeps the world, America, and our ally Israel safe.
Thank you, sir. And to finish up this question, Mr. Braun.
I think we're all going to agree on what President Trump has done, but I think the thing that you folks need to pay attention to, the dynamic of why it's occurring. This is occurring because you've got somebody that thinks out of the box, that's an outsider, and is not part of the political establishment. He has disrupted things and isn't going to accept business as usual. And I think as what this debate's about, who do you think among us on the stage is going to be more like President Trump? Who has built their cred in the private sector? Who has got the pathway that makes them an independent thinker and that won't go to Washington and just go with the flow? I think if there can't be a clearer difference among us on the stage. I've done things in the real world where you got to contend with these kinds of things, where you got to sharpen your skills and act accordingly. And I'll be the true reinforcement for President Trump to get this kind of thinking done.
Thank you, sir. For our next question, as we continue in foreign policy from right here in Fort Wayne, Wayne TV, Brett Thomas. Brett.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us here this evening in Fort Wayne. We love having you all here. China has promised to respond to President Trump's tariff threat with tariffs of its own, and it's targeting the Midwest as well as the Hoosier State by going after coal, soybeans, and other products that are made here. Jane Aide Stevens, the CEO of the Indiana Soybean Alliance, says a trade war would put farmers out of business. She says that knowing that a trade war with China would hurt Hoosiers considerably. I ask you, it might cost them their livelihood. Do you support Donald Trump's policies, tariff policies, if that means putting our own people out of a job?
And with that question, we start with answers, and we go to Mr. Messer.
Yeah, well, first, I reject the premise of the question. I do support President Trump's efforts towards China because China's been in a trade war with America for decades now. They manipulate their currency, they treat our products unfairly, and they steal our intellectual property. It's long past time somebody stood up to them, and I'm proud that this president is doing it. Now, as you cited in your question, China is acting like a bully, and they're threatening America farmers. Here again, I want to tell you, I am who I say I am. I'm a champion for Indiana farmers. I've tasseled corn, baled hay as a kid growing up. But let me tell you a story of a farmer I met with in Shelbyville, Indiana, who told me, yeah, Luke, listen, this may be tough in the short term, but please encourage the president to hold the line and stay tough against China, because our nation cannot afford to continue to let China abuse America's workers.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Braun, the question comes now to you.
President Trump throws things against the wall, and you can tell that he ends up with something that finally is different from business as usual. And, you know, my reason for doing this is I basically consider that same dynamic when I go there. And I think my two opponents, you know, one was a never Trumper, you know, was for someone else until it was inevitable. Another one who has been a recent for Trump, you know, called him vulgar and not presidential. I'm doing this not to mince words. I'm doing it because I'm fed up. And until you get more individuals like me there, you're not going to see people reinforcing Trump's agenda. And I frankly think it's disingenuous to come on lately, you know, when it's a foregone conclusion. You need guys like me that early on said you were inspired by him, and that's why I ran for Senate.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rokita, your first response.
Thank you, Pat. We have got to try something different. That's exactly what our president is doing. Our trade deficit is worse than at any time in world history, and we have to correct that. What I like what President Trump is doing with a targeted approach to these tariffs just on two products is he's giving us leverage at the bargaining table with these other countries because they are cheating. We want free trade, but free trade can't really be free unless it's fair. And I think it's a false choice to have to choose between our steelworkers and our manufacturers and our farmers. I've talked to farmers just this last weekend. Yes, some are concerned, but they certainly didn't want crooked Hillary Clinton to win. They certainly appreciate that we're leading again. And so what I suggest we do is let these tariffs work, and let's react to objective information and data and make sure we're not reacting to angst and fear. We have got to try something different because our trade deficit is at its highest it's ever been, and I think President Trump is going to get us a better deal in the end, and that's why I support him.
Thank you, sir. A little bit earlier, no name was given, but I read enough. I know who's who. So, Mr. Messer, to the things that were said by Mr. Braun, you have 30 seconds and 30 seconds only.
You know, listen, Matt, I mean, Mike, independent fact checkers have said those claims are false. You're throwing out those false claims because you want to hide the fact that you've been a lifetime Democrat who just switched parties in recent years. You call yourself an outsider. If you're outside anything, you're outside the Republican Party. When you were a wealthy businessman in southern Indiana, you didn't support Mitch Daniels or any other Republicans that were there. And Hoosier Republicans have to ask themselves, can you trust a guy who's been a lifetime Democrat, who's running a campaign full of falsehoods to be a values in Washington?
Pat, my name was invoked earlier as well.
Actually, it wasn't.
2 questions ago.
No. This is what we talked about earlier. I'm going to give one rebuttal if there is one, and then we're not going to ping pong this because I want substance. Okay. So that's what we're doing. So I'm going to go to the last question in this section, and we go to WLFI TV from Lafayette, Jeff Smith. Mr. Smith?
Are we still talking about foreign policy?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay, very good.
like it.
It's hard to tell sometimes.
I appreciate it.
Did you get a program on the way in? It would help you.
But that wasn't supposed to be a joke.
Go right ahead.
We love it.
Where do we stand on the necessity of having the wall? And what about Donald Trump's promise to make Mexico pay for it?
Okay, and for that we do start with you, sir, Mr. Braun.
Everything we can see, along with jobs in the economy, securing our border is paramount to Hoosiers. And when it's been systematically disregarded for decades, I think President Trump is right on the mark. It's not going to happen on its own. And I think we're going to need to build a wall where you have to build it. And I don't think you can address any of the other issues that are a result of it until you know the source of the problem is secure. So I think, again, that's been glossed over with not only Republicans but Democrats over the years. And thank goodness President Trump came along and is actually bringing this out as an issue. The key is who is going to be there that's going to be a true reinforcement to back that up when the votes count. These two guys vote 95% of the time the same. And it's generally been for an agenda that's different from what President Trump's talking about.
Thank you, sir. We now go to Mr. Rokita. Same question.
Jeff, and welcome to Fort Wayne. You're my hometown, one of my hometown guys in the 4th District, and I appreciate your work. Look, any country worth living in, any sovereign nation deserves to have a border, a secure border, so that we know who's coming in and that we know what's coming in. Did you know 95% of the heroin in this country is currently coming through our porous southern border? So it's just not who. We are a welcoming country. We want people to come the right way. The wall has to be built. It's one of the reasons I voted against this atrocious spending bill that put $1.3 trillion of debt on our kids' head. It didn't even have money for a real wall. It just had some money for some miles of fencing. I voted against it. Luke Messer voted for it, and Nancy Pelosi is grinning ear to ear. But that's the problem. We'll take it out on Mexico in trade. That's what President Trump meant, but we have got to secure that border. That's got to be job number one. And then we got to defund sanctuary cities, and not only defund them, we ought to slap handcuffs on local politicians who defy and ignore valid federal immigration law. And that's why we have Rokita's SLAP Act, to get that job done, to be part of this discussion as well, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Rokita. And finally on this topic, we go to Luke Messer. Luke?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Absolutely. We need to secure our border and build a wall. If securing our border and enforcing immigration laws wasn't popular, then Hillary Clinton would be president. This is one of the most important promises of President Trump's presidency. By the way, this didn't used to be partisan at all. Folks like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer voted for authorization of a southern border wall, border security, just a decade or so ago. But we now have to deliver. And this is another example of where I am who I say I am. I don't just talk about securing our border. I worked with the president to do it. I worked with the president to end child tax credits for illegal immigrants so that we could provide $7 to $9 billion a year, the kind of money that could be used to help build the wall and in effect make sure that Mexico pays for it. And I voted with the president when the commander-in-chief asked us to support his spending bill. Listen, you can believe Todd Rokita and Nancy Pelosi, or you can believe President Trump. He says this bill had a down payment on his wall, and it gets us started.
Thank you very much. And now we go on, and we're coming back to the head of the table here at the beginning, and we're going to switch channels. There are people in the room who are in law enforcement and some who are in the judiciary who have to deal with drug issues all the time. I think you have to be blind to say that there's not an opioid problem in the state of Indiana. We're going to address that now, and the question will first go to Mr. Rokita, and it will come from Tim Harmon.
Thank you. The opioid crisis has hit Indiana very hard, and there are two schools of thought about how to solve it. Do you think addiction should be primarily dealt with as a disease or as a crime?
I appreciate this question. There is an opioid epidemic. There is a drug culture that really we've had for decades in this country. I went down to Austin, Indiana, ground zero for our opioid epidemic and the HIV byproduct that it is spawning. And I went with law enforcement street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, to see exactly how detrimental this is to all of us. And it knows no economic bounds. It happens to the simplest of us and the most wealthy of us. I had a friend whose employee was just buried a few months ago. Why? Because 2 years earlier, she was in a simple car accident and was prescribed pain medication, and now she's dead. So we support funding efforts, law enforcement efforts, treatment efforts, but we're kidding ourselves if we think we can solve this with just money. We have a cultural problem that we have to correct. We ought to be enlisting clergy, nonprofits, community, and neighborhoods, and not just rely on the federal government to get this job done, or we'll fail. So yes, it's a disease. Yes, there is a law enforcement component. The last thing we should do is be legalizing marijuana. That would only exacerbate the problem.
Thank you, sir. Same thing, opioids in Indiana, and that's to you, Mr. Messer.
Yeah, listen, this is a tragedy that knows no bounds all across our state. I spoke with the mayor of Muncie, and he told me that as much as 10% of kids born in the NICU unit and hospitals there are born addicted to drugs. I've spoken to mayors across the state. In particular, I remember a conversation with the mayor of Huntington that said as much as 80 to 90% of law enforcement incidents in small towns all across Indiana are related to this drug epidemic. This is another example where President Trump is leading. He's declared this a national emergency, and we're getting after a serious plan to deal with this crisis. Treatment is part of the answer. We need to do more to work on prescribing drugs. And as Todd said, to get the clergy and the school community engaged in helping with these challenges as well. It's going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to get this done. But I'm telling you, as you travel around this state, Hoosiers are demanding that we together come together and take action.
Mr. Braun, to you, sir.
So clearly it needs to be a balance between stricter enforcement and rehabilitation. But if you're really going to get to the root of any of these problems, here's the dynamic I would take to it. When I found out the fifth largest company in our country, McKesson, had the knowledge that opioids were being sold at a level way out of bounds, like any distributor would know just by looking at their information, you're going to you need somebody that will go there not afraid to speak up, because that lobby is probably one of the strongest out there. When I go there, I can guarantee you I'm not doing it for the pay and the perks. I'm going to do it to have real impact on a few issues. And when you looked at the prescription formula when it was 30 days, and of course that's a sacred cow, that was pain management through, AMA. So you've got to be able to speak up and make a difference and get to the heart of these issues if you're going to solve them.
Thank you. Kevin Rader from WTHR. Mr. Rader, your question will first go to Luke Messer.
Right now, a lot of Hoosiers who maybe Indiana is now limiting the amount of opioids that can be prescribed by a physician. Many are turning to heroin. I think to avoid heroin, we're missing the boat on this. Let's talk a little bit about possible needle exchange, which I know then Governor Pence, one-time Governor Pence, had endorsed and actually used in the state of Indiana. Would you guys support that?
Mr. Messer?
Well, I've been down to Austin, and I know the unique circumstances there that led to local leaders deciding to use those needles. It does seem to me that that's the approach to use here. Instead of having some kind of one-size-fits-all federal or even state-level program dealing with that, we ought to deal with it at a local level. This is a crisis of epidemic proportions across our state, and I think it's an area where folks are demanding action. I applaud the fact that the president's brought billions of dollars in funding to these rehabilitation programs that will include tens of millions of dollars for programs within our state. And when you travel and you go to coffee shops and you have conversations, this crisis knows no bound. We all know there's no silver bullet to fixing it, but we're going to have to get serious about the proposals.
Todd Rokita.
There is the local officials there were promoting it. Law enforcement at the same time didn't seem to like it as much, and law enforcement in other places don't seem to think it's solving anything. So whatever we do, it should be a local decision. Kevin, we should not prescribe a one-size-fits-all measure from the federal government or make it mandatory in any kind of program. Local leaders in communities know what's best, and that's how we should treat it. I'm very supportive of our president continuing to call this a national emergency and epidemic, and that's why I supported the CARE Act to make sure that these programs were funded, taking money from other places, deprioritizing those, and putting money to this epidemic. But I will reiterate the fact that money is not going to solve this, ladies and gentlemen. We have a cultural drug problem, and we need to address it. Let's build the economy. Let's continue with more tax cuts so that you have a choice of a great-paying job and not drugs. Let's build the wall because, as Kevin alluded to, 95% of the heroin in this country is coming through a porous southern border.
Sir.
That's what we can do at the federal level.
Mr. Braun, the next question comes to you first, and it comes from Kevin Leininger from the News Sentinel.
Gentlemen, to do anything you're talking about, the Republicans presumably will have to control the Senate. Right now, you control not only the Senate, but the House and the White House. And yet, there have, I think, honestly been few major legislative accomplishments in the last year and a half. And one of those, the appointment and confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, happened only because the Republicans invoked the nuclear option that the Democrats first used in 2013 in regard to judges. So my question to you is, if you think you should be judged on the record of the party, and it's difficult to pass legislation given the filibuster, should the Senate vote to enact a rule under which you would pass all legislation by a mere majority vote?
Question to you, Mr. Braun.
We did, not only Neil Gorsuch, we did get past the, in my opinion, most significant legislation since the Reagan years. And that tax bill for enterprisers and entrepreneurs like myself, unmeasurable in what it's going to do to, I think, unleash economic activity. And thank goodness there was a guy named Ron Johnson that was there that actually came out and, stood for that. So if not, it would have been only the big companies getting helped again. That's where I have that same type of weigh in to help small businesses. Republicans and conservatives ought to be proud and sure about the stuff they do pass. And I think it's time for the filibuster to go, because I'd love to see the Democrats try to overturn this tax legislation. I think it would put them permanently out of the mix for a long time. I think to get anything done, I trust what conservatives would do, what Republicans would do, and I would be for seeing the filibuster go.
Thank you, sir. And next, Todd Rokita.
Yeah, Kevin, I would respectfully suggest that there's been other successes, too. More deregulation. In fact, the president signed one of my deregulation bills at the top of the year. More deregulation we've seen out of 1 year of the Trump administration than some say President Reagan even was able to get done in 8. So, and then, of course, the tax cuts, which are providing every American and every Hoosier an average of $85 back in their paychecks. Thousands getting $1,000 or more bonuses, which is why I've created the Crumbs Act, because those bonuses should be tax-free. Nancy Pelosi's crumbs, we should make them tax-free. With regard to the filibuster, let me say, let's be smart about it. Yes, there has to be reform. Let's physically make these senators put on their Depends undergarments or whatever they have to do and physically hold the floor. That would stop a lot of this nonsense to begin with. And instead of a burden of 60 votes to go forward, what if we had 60 votes to stop something? Make the obstructionist vote to hold things up instead of letting them hide. Those are some smart ways that we could have some filibuster reform, but still have a good backstop to keep liberal stuff from happening, like cap and trade, like gun control, all things that didn't happen in the Senate because we had a filibuster.
Thank you, sir. And finally, on this question, to Luke Messer.
Well, my answer is yes. I've been campaigning on this for months that we need to end the filibuster. Mitch McConnell's been mad at me for months because of it. I welcome my colleagues here to the party. I guess that's another example of leadership, because the filibuster filibuster does need to go away. Whatever the filibuster used to be, and some say in the past it in some way contributed to bipartisanship, it has become a tool of partisan gamesmanship that puts the minority party in charge in our chamber. As both these men have described, the biggest achievements that have come within the Trump administration, tax cuts, appointment of federal judges, have come in the areas where we don't have a filibuster. We need to get rid of it in its entirety. Listen, our republic is at risk here. The American people are becoming frustrated because they're starting to believe that elections don't matter. We have a Republican majority. I can guarantee you this, the Democrats will change it as soon as they're in power. Let's change the filibuster now, as President Trump has requested, and let's get a whole lot more done.
Thank you, sir. As we've gotten into the area now, as Kevin has led us into talking about accomplishments or lack thereof by Republicans, let's talk about the importance or the way for Republicans to control the House and or the Senate. And for that, we move to Brian McElhatton. Brian, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Here we go to another question here. I want to ask you, gentlemen, about term limits. It's something all of you have talked about. Many of your websites, your talking points list that as something you deeply believe, and it goes back to draining the swamp. In regards to term limits, many of the voters here we've talked to have said they're fed up with the career politicians. My question for you is this: if elected, put yourselves in the shoes of the senator, because I know you've all thought about it. You're thinking about it right now. Would you propose legislation to enact term limits, and what would that legislation look like?
And for the first answer, we go down to the opposite end once again into Todd Rokita. Mr. Rokita.
Well, Brian, I have thought about it, and I have introduced legislation. I co-sponsor the strongest term limit legislation right now in the House of Representatives with other like-minded representatives. I'm the only one here on stage that has lived under a term limit and was happy to do so when I was your two-term Secretary of State. And I'm voluntarily term limiting myself now as a congressman. I've taken the term limit pledge, and I've co-sponsored the legislation. It's going to continue to be on my list of things to get done. It's a high bar, of course. You have to change the Constitution, but I think it's worth it. 2 terms for a U.S. Senator or 6 terms for a congressman is what my legislation says. And I'll tell you something else. 3 or 4 times now, we've had Luke Messer up here talking about, I am who I say I am. Ladies and gentlemen, when someone has to repeatedly tell you that is the first red flag and the first sign that he's not who he says he is. He wants you to believe he lives here, but he lives in Virginia with his family, and that's fine. That doesn't mean you're a good Senate candidate. Ask Dick Lugar or Evan Bayh. He's for a pathway to citizenship, just like Schumer and Pelosi are. And you can go to toddrokita.com and see him on national TV saying so. He's bragging about how he's with President Trump, but when it mattered most, when we were working against crooked Hillary Clinton to literally try to save this country from more socialism, Luke Messer was on the Clinton News Network, CNN, disparaging the president. Don't have to believe me. Go to toddrokita.com and see the footage for yourself.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Messer, I will let you respond to the attack there. I'm going to ask you first to answer the question. I'll let Mr. Braun answer, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay, absolutely. Appreciate that opportunity. Yes, I support term limits. I've actually lived them. This is another example of where I say I am who I say I am. I served in the General Assembly for 4 years. I served in Congress now for no more than 6 years. By the way, I've served in office 10 years. You got a guy here that served for 14 years in office, a guy here that served for 16 years, if we want to talk about folks that have been a part of the process. The American people are frustrated with what they're seeing in Washington. I think this rule is a lot like the filibuster. Whatever it used to be, we need to inject new blood into these bodies. The right answer, I think, in the Senate is 2 6-year terms, no more than 12 years. There are a whole lot of ways to save and serve your state and your nation that include not being in office at all. And I think this is important for our republic that we make this change happen.
Thank you, sir. And to you, Mr. Braun.
Well, I signed the term limits pledge before early after declaring 2 terms for a senator, 3 for a U.S. rep. And it kind of humors me when I hear these guys saying I'm terming myself out to run for Senate. That's something you'd hear out of a career politician. And I think you've always got to look at one's record. And if you consider being a school board member, being an insider, I about laughed off the stage when I heard that the first time. I built my career where it counts, where you put up with the consequences of politicians and bureaucrats. And when it comes to getting this government to work like the founders intended, all I can tell you, if you like what you've seen, you can get folks that have been in there through the farm system. If you really want to change it, you're going to have to get people that look at things differently. And that's not by recycling folks that have been in the game of politics for nearly 25 years, despite what they say about term limits.
Thank you, sir. Just before we move on, I go back to you, Mr. Messer. Mr. Rokita seemed to have some thoughts directed at you, so I give you 30 seconds, sir.
Listen, I say I am who I say I am, frankly, because my opponents aren't. You know, Todd Rokita, people see through these attacks. Last week, in an extraordinary step, President Trump's campaign admonished him and told him to take down advertisements because he was faking the president's support. He puts on a MAGA hat, he runs around the state, he says he's with the president, but on the tough votes takes to pass President Trump's agenda, including protecting our troops. And independent fact checkers, not me. I mean, not only has President Trump called him down, independent fact checkers have said Todd Rokita's campaign is mostly false. Okay, we have to beat Joe Donnelly. We're going to have to do it with an authentic conservative who tells the truth.
When we do rebuttals, we allow the rebuttal to take its full course. There will be all kinds of rules that you'll follow in the Senate. I'm sure they're pretty similar. Let's go to Brett Thomas. Brett, as we continue on this vein.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. I want to talk about money. I want to talk about debt and deficits. After passing the president's tax cut plan, conservative estimates put forth by the CBO say it's going to add $1 trillion a year to the deficit. The national debt's going to reach nearly 100% of GDP by the year 2028. Then, right after that, relatively recently, the Republican Congress passed one of the largest spending bills in history. So my question is, what has ever happened to fiscal responsibility?
And to that question, that comes to Luke Messer. Mr. Messer.
Well, I appreciate your question. Look, I think there's several steps we need to take to balance the budget. I think it's serious talk. The first thing that we have to do is having a growing economy. Look, this president came to office facing challenges really not seen since Ronald Reagan first came to office. You had a flagging military that wasn't prepared for our modern challenges. You had an economy full of stagnant wages where working people were not having the opportunities they need. And then you also had debt. The way we get after debt is to do what happened in the 1990s, have a growing economy with more taxpayers and better paying jobs that can then bring coffers and fill our coffers into debt. Second, we've got to have a strong military. Look, if you think that peace is expensive, try war. And so we've got to make sure that we have our military funded. And then we're going to have to get after spending too. With the kind of leadership you're seeing from this president, the way he is changing dynamics all across this country, I believe that can happen. I look forward to working with him to make sure we do.
And now we come to Mr. Braun.
And now we have to get after spending too. So this happened back in the Reagan years. And of course, we had a tax cut, and there was not the fortitude or the backbone to do anything with spending. And the only good thing about that was we were not deeply into debt. And since that time, we've had Republicans and Democrats lead us down the road to where we are now. And I can tell you, in the real world, the way I operate, it's been where you work in the black, you have a cash balance if you want to go on to the next day. And it's a simple thing. If you think the dynamic of doing what these guys have been doing is going to solve the problem, or they've been part of it, or do you need somebody like me that's actually had to do those things at the business level and has done it for 37 years? I think that's a clear, easy answer there.
And to Todd Rokita. Mr. Rokita?
No, if it's such a clear, easy answer, then why is Mike Braun's solution to every problem to raise taxes? 45 times, including the state's largest in history. I don't think that's the solution to anything. This spending bill was absolutely atrocious, $1.3 trillion on the heads of our kids and grandkids. For those of us who saw President Trump's press conference, did he look like he was asking for that bill? He himself likened it to a pile of garbage and said he would never do it again, and that's because it was a pile. This is what happens when establishment Republicans get together with Democrats and foist this on the American people. It was a false choice. Just 2 weeks earlier, we voted to fund the troops, to rebuild our military, and again, the United States Senate failed us, and that's why I'm running, to provide real leadership there. What President Trump wanted to do is the same thing Todd Rokita want to do. We want to defund Planned Parenthood. That bill that Luke Messer voted for funds Planned Parenthood. We wanted to defund sanctuary cities. That bill continues to fund sanctuary cities. And we wanted to build a real wall made of concrete, not fence that you can pass drugs through and people can climb over. And that's why Nancy Pelosi, along with establishment Republicans, is grinning ear to ear.
Mr. Braun, he made direct contact with you relative to the numbers of time you have supported tax increases. Would you like to respond?
Thank you. You know, when you're in the last gasp of losing a career, you'll do or say anything. So, when he came up with that,
wrong?
When he came up with that,
say you didn't raise taxes.
Sir, I'm going to ask you not to do that, Mr. Braun.
When he came up with that was the road bill that Governor Daniels, Governor Pence, Governor Holcomb, and then finally a state legislature that had enough fortitude to know that we had a long-term problem. 10-cent gas increase. Every mayor, every county council, every city council was behind it. And you'll hear that when you've got nothing else to talk about. Just like when they say you're voted Democratic. I was in one of the most conservative counties in the state, and my wife and I only did that to weigh in on local elections. You're not going to become the next U.S. Senator saying stuff like that. That's when you've got no game of your own.
Thank you very much. Now for the last question in this segment, and we have about 7 minutes left in this portion of the broadcast, so we're going to move this as best we can. Jeff Smith from WLFI, your question, sir, will be directed first to Mr. Braun.
This race is getting a lot of national attention, from local to state to national races. Across the country this year, Democrats are winning races in unexpectedly red districts. How do you expect this race to not follow that pattern?
That's very simple. If you want a bad result, you're going to end up with two guys. If one of them gets there, they're not going to contrast with Joe Donnelly. You're going to need to send somebody there that has done something in the real world that's going to contrast with what the problem has been. Sure, they're going to have the conservative platitudes out there, but they spent their career in politics. And to retire Joe Donnelly, you're going to need someone that can go there and actually talk about how you're going to solve health care. 10 years ago, I had to take the bull by the horns and do something because big insurance was not delivering us a quality product. Big government and big health care got together and delivered us Obamacare. And if you're going to try to get that stuff changed, as well as rebuilding infrastructure, get somebody that's done something in the real world to do something about it, not two folks that have been part of the problem. I'll be the one that can contrast with Joe Donnelly and articulate things that'll work where I've done it in my own business career.
Thank you, sir. We go to Todd Rokita. Mr. Rokita.
Listen, when I go all over the state, just like when I was Secretary of State and I drove 45,000 miles per year for 8 years, visiting all of Indiana's 92 counties at least once per year, I know this. We're unified. We understand who Joe Donnelly is, and with the right candidate, we're going to expose Joe Donnelly for who he is. He votes with Bernie Sanders 85% of the time. He votes to fund Planned Parenthood. He votes to fund sanctuary cities. He doesn't support President Trump in nearly anything, certainly not building the wall. I want to have English as our official language to unify us. We are going to have a very aggressive campaign, and we're going to win. I know the state. And the voters and taxpayers of the state know me. We've had great success twice on the statewide ballot, and that's one of the reasons we're going to beat Joe Donnelly. I'm very proud to have the endorsement of the Trump Indiana team from 2016. That's what my signs proudly say. That's what my advertisements say, because they know I was in the trenches with all of us making sure we had a President Trump and not a President Crooked Hillary Clinton. And that has made all the difference. And that's why I've earned their endorsement. And I would appreciate yours as well.
Thank you, sir. Luke Messer.
We're going to beat Joe Donnelly with the truth. Joe Donnelly is not who he says he is. He talks conservative back home in Indiana, but he's a lifetime Democrat that votes liberal in Washington. We're not going to beat Joe Donnelly with another Joe Donnelly. I mean, the reality is Mike Braun, despite all he's saying tonight, is a lifetime Democrat pretending to be a Republican so he can somehow buy an election. Hoosiers see through it. They understand that a Harvard Democrat is not a likely champion for Hoosier conservative values. And Todd can say what he says. Listen, Todd Rokita knows that President Trump could not have been clearer. Our commander-in-chief and General Mattis asked us to support that legislation. Todd Rokita was told last week by the Trump administration to take down his advertisements because he's faking support from the Trump campaign. He's got the support of a couple Trump campaign volunteers. That's the reality of it. He doesn't vote with the president on the tough votes, and outside sources have said, outside independent fact checkers have said his campaign's mostly false. I am who I say I am. We're going to take the truth to Joe Donnelly, and when we do, we'll win.
Two rebuttals real quick, and then I turn it back over to Kevin, or to Brian rather. First of all, Mr. Braun, a lifetime Democrat from Harvard.
Well, I got an economics degree at Wabash, and I think it did me a little better than these two guys here. I know how to balance a budget. When you got into Harvard directly out of Wabash, they don't even do it anymore. So, you know what I did? Moved back to my hometown. I knew that I would raise a family there and build a business. And what's really laughable is along the way, I've had to put up with politicians and bureaucrats, and these two guys vote alike 95% of the time, and they've been part of the problem. It's not a complicated solution here. You're going to need to get folks that have done something in the real world that know how to solve problems, or it's going to be business as usual in D.C.
Thank you, sir. Here's my promise. We're changing formats here, and so as soon as we come back, you will have your chance at your rebuttal as we go to the live stream, and then we're going to come back, and in this next segment, all of the people on the panel will ask questions as whatever they want to ask. We call it the Kevin Leininger rule, and so we'll be doing that. And so to wrap up this portion, I go back to our good friend from ABC 21, Brian McElhatton. Brian?
Well, thank you, Pat. Thank you, our television viewers at home, for watching right along with us. Our on-air coverage is ending now, but we will stream much more of this debate, another 30 minutes of it on this website, WPTA21.com/U.S. Senate debate. And a reminder, get out and vote. The primary election is in 2 weeks, May 8th, and the deadline for absentee voting is April 30th. So take what you're learning here tonight, use it how you see fit, and go to the polls and make your decision. For complete voting information and to learn who's on the ballot, the voting hours, even your polling location, you can visit the state-run website, indianavoters.in.gov. If I can ask everyone here to give a round of applause for the candidates and for the panelists here. This concludes our broadcast version of the debate. Stay with us. There is more to come streaming to you on the internet. Still tuned in, and of course folks on their smartphones and their computers around the state are watching this as well. So Pat, let's turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir, and let's do this. I did promise to Mr. Rokita that he would have the last shot at the rebuttal from the previous question, so go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Look, Luke Messer pretends to live here amongst us. He lives in Virginia. Luke Messer pretends to be for tax cuts, but he's raised $1 billion worth of taxes. Luke Messer is for a pathway to citizenship, and he said that repeatedly with his counterpart, Adam Schiff, on national TV. And you can go to toddrokita.com to see that exact thing. Recently, we find out, Luke Messer withholds his driving record when he's going to replace someone who was in office who was killed by a drunk driver. The precinct committeeman, and we have a lot in the room, would have never have allowed that. Luke Messer is not who he says he is.
All right, thank you, sir. And also thanks to our audience that has continued with us. Again, on behalf of Steve Shine and the Allen County Republican Party, thank you very much. Now, again, panelists, you can pick whichever topic that you would like. We're going to start down here with Tim Harbin, and we'll come right down the table. Tim, if you would, please.
Thank you, Pat. Gentlemen, let's talk a moment about the Dreamers. In our state, there are more than 9,000 young people studying and working under DACA protection who were brought here as young children and know no other country as their own. In your view, should the Dreamers be deported as illegal immigrants or offered a path to citizenship as aspiring American citizens?
And that question goes first to Todd Rokita. Mr. Rokita, Dreamers.
Thank you. There can be no deal for the DACA recipients until we have a wall. A wall needs to be built or guaranteed to be built with the money in a trust fund dedicated for that sole purpose that can't be taken out. And the reason is simple. The reason is humane. There is no sense in doing a deal, to use our president's word, on DACA until we make sure the problem can't be repeated. And until you have a wall, the problem will continue to repeat itself. No, I am not for a pathway to citizenship. That is another code word for amnesty. You can go to toddrokita.com to see Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Luke Messer, and others call for a pathway to citizenship. That is not acceptable. Not because we're mean, but because we believe in the rule of law. Because there's a crime committed and some kind of punishment has to be paid. And we can figure it out. We can do a deal for the DACA recipients. We need to build the wall first. And that's why I'm completely supportive of the president. The president offered this deal, and the Democrats walked away from it because it's the Democrats, led by Joe Donnelly, who don't want to solve this problem. They want to pander and scare people, and that's not leadership, and that's why we have to replace Joe Donnelly in the United States Senate.
All right, it's Mr. Messer.
Listen, I think the president's got this right. I think he has said no wall, no DACA. I think there's opportunities to do something about DACA, but it includes border security. I do feel like I have to respond a little bit here, Pat, since I got attacked, didn't get a response. Look, so many attacks in so little time. So let me just go through them best I can. First, Todd Rokita attacks my family. I'm a lifetime Hoosier. I've got a home in Indiana. I love my kids. Our family stays together, just like Mike Pence did, just like Dan Quayle did, just like Dan Coates did. He says we raise taxes. He's talking about Mitch Daniels. Every Republican in this room knows that Mitch Daniels balanced budgets without raising taxes. I was proud to work with him to do it. He attacks my past. Listen, I've acknowledged my mistakes. They happened 23 and 28 years ago, and Hoosiers care a whole lot more about our state's future than they do our past. And he keeps making these allegations about immigration. Look, I'm the person on this stage that's actually worked with the president to help secure our border, worked with the president to actually pass legislation that stops tax credits for illegal immigrants in this country. We got enough talk. Let's get busy with action.
All right, sir, and to Mr. Braun.
Well, we all agree on the fact that the border has to be secure, and I think President Trump is right because it's gone on for so long, and there's been no resolution, no solution. So when it comes to DACA, I think that has to fall right in line with sanctuary cities, with visa lotteries, all the complications that have occurred from not having a secure border. And I think when it comes to the status, citizenship, everybody should be put into the same pool to where we then, once the border's secure, we start having a policy that is based upon what's good for this country. And we do not have unlimited capacity to have anyone come in that wants to. And when you're going to actually get those kinds of things done, I again think it's more about the dynamic of who you send there. Anybody that's been there over the last 10, 20 years, and these guys have held office at the federal level, you've got to accept some responsibility for it. And trying to blame one another, again, they voted 95% of the time the same way.
Thank you, sir. All right, for the next question, and again, of your choice, we go from Indianapolis, WTHR, Kevin Rader. Kevin?
I think there's a general consensus that Russia has interfered with our election process, and the president is pretty adamant about saying it's better to work with Russia than work against Russia. So I'm curious, is Russia a friend or a foe?
Mr. Messer?
Well, I mean, Russia is a foe that we have to deal with. You know, it is ironic that a couple presidential elections ago, Barack Obama chastised our candidate when he said that Russia was our biggest geopolitical threat in the entire world. But you're right, Kevin. You know, it does appear that Russia tried to meddle in our elections, but I'll tell you this, I haven't talked to one Hoosier who believes that the Russians made them vote for either presidential candidate in the last election. Right? So what we need to do is get to the facts, and we have. There's no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and now move on to all the other big challenges we face as a country, getting this economy going again, securing our border, making sure that we pass pro-life, pro-Second Amendment policies, and get away from some of this palace intrigue that's you read in the media every day.
Thank you, sir. To Mike Braun.
Well, I think, President Trump, again, has done what no recent president has done, and the Russian dynamic has been there for a long time. And I'm glad that he is able to do two things at once, and that is to call Russians out for when they are doing things that are not right, when they're a bad player. But he's also right. They're a major power in this world. And I think you're better to have a channel of communication to where you can at least talk about things, and draw the parallel. North Korea. Look what former presidents, Republicans and Democrats, have given us. Led us up to the precipice. And now President Trump has changed that dynamic for the first time. So the real thing to get out of this is that he is a guy that thinks differently, thinks out of the box. That's because he's done things in the real world, and you hone your skills there more than being in the career of being a politician.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rokita.
Kevin, we are 180 degrees different from the last administration. The last administration under President Obama's mantra was lead from behind. Ladies and gentlemen, that's another way to say don't lead. President Trump has turned that on its head, and the dictators of the world who only respect one thing, and that is power, are seeing a completely different attitude. They see a new sheriff in town, and we are taking control of the situation. Not only in terms of Russia, but also in terms of North Korea. Listen, as your recently former Secretary of State, I can tell you Russia did not meddle in the vote tally of our election. That's impossible. Now, after a year of the Mueller investigation, we find out that the only evidence of criminality, the only evidence of wrongdoing, is actually from Hillary Clinton, Jim Comey, McCabe, Lynch, others. And that's why I and a few other leaders in the House of Representatives sent a letter of criminal referral to about the individuals I just mentioned, because this shouldn't be over, Luke. This shouldn't be just palace intrigue and moving away from it. We ought to lock Hillary up. An election is not justice. We ought to lock these other ones up because they are corroding and eroding the rule of law.
Thank you, sir. Kevin Leininger from the News Sentinel. It's your question, sir, and you'll direct it first to Mr. Braun.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I like that Kevin Leininger rule.
Sure,
I think it's important to get off the well-beaten path and try to get to what makes candidates tick.
You make the check out to Pat Miller.
Thank you. But I'm with the $20. Mr. Braun's ads have stressed his Christian faith and the fact that he attends church regularly, but all three of you are Christians who have talked about the importance of faith in public life and in American society. So my question is, how does your faith influence your politics? And to what degree, if any, should that faith influence whether people vote for you? And maybe most important of all, where do you draw the line between legitimate religious freedom and discrimination?
Mr. Braun.
Hopefully faith would underpin everyone's values. And I know for me, I grew up in a German Catholic community where we have 4 churches in a town of 16,000 people. So I think the farther we have drifted away from faith being the foundation of how we lead our daily lives, what we do in government, we've gotten farther away from what the founders intended. So I'm going to be one that I'm 100% pro-life. Whenever we have the opportunity to legislate in a way, I was so disappointed in the Senate recently when they couldn't even come to agreement on having a limitation of abortion after 20 weeks. You know, that's sad. And I think if you don't use the values that you were raised on and that you believe in, you know, we see a lot of that in play today. So every chance I get, I've lived my life in faith. I'll use those principles when I go to Washington and weigh in accordingly.
Thank you, sir. Todd Rokita.
It is important that when you are a statewide official, like when I was Secretary of State, that you understand that you represent all of us, all Hoosiers. And it's that is what guides me in statewide office. But Hoosier voters deserve to know that I am a man of faith, and that my faith does guide me. I'm the only one up here that's 100% pro-life, no exceptions, because you will never get me to say that it is okay to intentionally kill innocent human life. My faith guides me in that. Also, our son Teddy, he's 10 years old, and if he walked in the room right now, he wouldn't do it well, and he's never said a word and probably never will. But he'd have a big smile on his face. He has got a very rare and severe neurological disorder, and everyone here would get a big hug whether he knew you or not. Kathy and I think Teddy's going to change the world. And we also know that there are liberal elites among us, media elites, Hollywood elites, that would look at Teddy and say he's imperfect. But we know that because he is a gift from God, he is by definition perfect. And so I'm 100% pro-life. I'm also accountable. I stand up for my votes. I'm proud to live in Brownsburg, Indiana. I'm proud of what we get done here in the state. And that's who you'll have as your next U.S. Senator.
To Luke Messer.
Thank you for the question. I am a Christian. I'm a person of faith. And I think it's important that the listeners tonight know that as proud as I am to be running for the Senate, as proud as I am in my service for our state, this job will never be any higher than the third priority in my life, because my faith and my family come before that. I know I've been under attack for some from that. Also, as a person of faith, I can tell you that I'm well aware of my own imperfections, and I understand that as a Christian, that only through grace am I able to stand through the day. And in my service, listen, I just try to live by the golden rule. Do the right thing, regardless of the political consequences. And frankly, this tax session we've had on the spending bill is a most recent example of that. The vast majority of Republicans serving in Washington and Indiana voted with the president on that bill because the men and women in our military are dying because they don't have the equipment and the training they need. And frankly, whatever the politics are, I am who I say I am. When I tell President Trump I'll support him, I'm going to go do it.
Thank you, sir. And now we go on to Brian McElhatton from WPTA 21. And Brian, your first question will go to Todd Rokita.
Okay. Mr. Rokita, gentlemen, if you get this job, you're heading to the halls of the Senate to represent us and to bring the state's issues, shine a national spotlight on that. I want to ask each of you, what is the big triage a little bit for me? What is the most important issue facing Indiana, the biggest issue facing Indiana in your minds? And what kind of help would you be able to offer if you were to reach the Senate? Thank you.
Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Pat. We mentioned the opioid epidemic. We have got to get it under control. And I pledge and have been a full partner and hard supporter to get that job done, knowing that the biggest job isn't just supplying money. It's making sure that we can change our culture so that this doesn't hurt more of us. All of us have family members or friends of friends that have been impacted by this. Spending is what's going to hurt us most. It's why recently the Joint Chief of Staff Chairman said our biggest threat, if you can believe it, isn't North Korea, isn't Syria or Iran, it's our debt. And as Vice Chairman of the House Budget Committee, I've taken that very seriously. And we've bettered the situation by $6 trillion compared to if Nancy Pelosi was still Speaker of the House. And that's why you have got to hold the line and vote no when no is what's required to be said. It is not fair for the children of tomorrow to have to foot this bill because we're given false choices by the elites, by the establishment, who continue to foist false choices on us so that we can't get the work done that we need to in the military, and that we continue to put this from a civics perspective, it's the most immoral thing I've seen. We put this on the heads of people who cannot vote. mostly because they may not even exist yet. There are children and grandchildren that we're going to have to foot the bill for our largesse. I will always be a true fighter to make sure that gets reversed.
Thank you, sir. We go now to Luke Messer.
Well, thank you for that question. Listen, some of the biggest challenges we face as a state, just as the challenges we face as a nation, are cultural. And on many of those issues, I don't want a federal government big enough to deal with those challenges. I do support religious freedom, and I think that having God back in our society is one of the most important steps to move this country forward. But of the issues that we can deal with from a policy perspective, the first, as you talk to Hoosier families, is jobs in the economy. Frozen paychecks, folks who for decades have seen their wages flatline in the middle of this economy. And this is where I was proud to work with President Trump on tax cuts that are putting more money in every worker's paycheck, that are creating higher wages as employers compete, and they're seeing bonuses as well. We also need to secure our border. Listen, we have economic security reasons to secure our border. We have national security reasons to secure our border. And now with the flood of drugs across our border, we have public health reasons to secure our border. President Trump promised it, and I look forward to working with him to get it done.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Braun.
Great topic. Of course, the border and border security is important to all Hoosiers. We've already covered it. Jobs in the economy. 37 years, I've been growing jobs, been signing the front side of paychecks, not endorsing the back side, and hard scrabble, early go, 17 years, had 15 employees. From 98 to 2008, grew to 300. From 2008, when it looked like the bleakest hour of our economy, we actually grew from 300 employees to 850. Who do you think is going to have one practical idea, if not many more, about what really counts about jobs in the economy? Never had a layoff in my company. Pay the highest entry-level wage in my county. Have a health care plan that works and that's sustainable. That's what Hoosiers are interested in. That's what Americans are interested in. And until you get people that have lived it and done it in the real world, you're going to have politicians that see it through the lens of a politician, and you're going to keep getting the same results. I can't wait to get to the Senate to really weigh in.
Thank you, sir. And now we go to Brett Thomas from Wayne TV. And Brett, your question will first go to Mr. Messer.
All right, very good. I was talking to a financial advisor who may or may not be in this room and may or may not be my neighbor, but I can't say for certain. I asked him, what's a simple question that a lot of Hoosiers are worried about? What's just something really, that is really bugging them, that really bothering them? And it has to do with Social Security. It's not about whether it's going to be around or not. It's the fact that seniors have to pay taxes on their Social Security benefits that they've already paid taxes on. Is there anything that can be done about that to bring relief to some of our senior citizens, some of the greatest generation?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. Thanks for asking it. It's a big challenge in the broader economy. It's actually why I have authored legislation that would essentially double the tax-deductible income that seniors can receive. Listen, when you talk to employers across this state, they will tell you, thanks for the tax cuts. I appreciate this president's approach in deregulating, but we have a challenge in getting the workforce we need to have a business that can thrive and grow. And so what we need to do is to help create incentives to bring more folks into the workforce. Some of that are seniors who decide they want to work as well. Now, unfortunately, many of these seniors are penalized for doing that. It's wrong. We need to change it. And I think it's a common sense change of the type that you can see out under the leadership of this president.
Thank you, sir. And that means, Mr. Braun, the question comes to you.
Well, this is another one that's puzzling to somebody like me that's had to solve problems way before they hit you in the head. It's not like the arithmetic on Social Security and Medicare is snuck up on us. It's been there for a long time, and the real underlying reason, again, is just like in the state of Indiana. You had to address infrastructure. We actually waited until some of the overpasses were falling in. Social Security, you don't want it to fall apart. Obviously, there are going to have to be some hard decisions made if it's going to be there for future generations. And begs the other question. More jobs, you'd have more people paying into it. And we've got a state that has made it a priority to emphasize workforce development. 30,000 jobs currently go unfilled because we are not getting it right in supporting institutions in the state that are shipping out twice as many four-year degrees as we need, and they can't get it right on 30,000 jobs that would be here, paying, in many cases, more than a four-year degree. Why has that not occurred? Well, my time at the State House, it's been given lip service, but that, again, is a sacred cow. If you want to solve it, you got to make hard decisions like we do in the business world.
Thank you, sir. Our final question for the evening, and it will come first to Mr. Braun, and it will come from Jeff Smith. I'm very sorry, Mr. Rokita.
That's okay.
I was still waiting for the $20 to clear.
Here again, every time there's a complex problem, whether it's Mike Braun or so many others of the elite establishment, the first answer is to raise your taxes. Your question went to, what about cutting taxes? Because you're exactly right. Senior citizens are being taxed double. So I am for reducing that second tax just for the same reason that I'm against the death tax. People have already been taxed on that once, and they shouldn't be constricted from passing that money on to future generations. So it's this very same logic, and I'm very consistent about making sure that senior citizens don't have to pay a second time on a tax. But $20 trillion in debt. We cannot make good on that, what I just suggested for senior citizens, if we don't get this under control. And as Vice Chairman of the House Budget Committee, we have worked on it. We have presented the plan to make sure that we have the luxury to cut taxes for senior citizens who are on Social Security, to make sure that these programs, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, are around for future generations and strengthened. But it's Joe Donnelly and the lack of leadership in the Democratic Party that demagogues the issue and scares seniors. And with Todd Rokita as our nominee, I'm going to make sure that there's an accurate representation of what we want to do, which is to save these programs, help senior citizens, and make sure they're around for future generations. And Joe Donnelly won't get away demagoguing the issue and scaring senior citizens when I'm the nominee.
Thank you, Todd. Very sorry for the slight, sir. Now the final question, and it comes to Mr. Braun, and it does, in fact, come from Jeff Smith of WLFI.
Income inequality, it's approaching levels apparently not seen since the Gilded Age. People feeling left behind, that may have something to do with the opioid crisis, or at least part of that as well. What's being done for the bottom 25% as opposed to what's being done for the top 1%?
Great question. So we've set the stage with a tax cut that carries responsibility with it. I do believe it's going to gin up the economy to where we keep growing at an annual rate of 3% or a little more. But incumbent upon that is all of us enterprisers. I know in my own hometown, my employees are like family. I've got several generations of folks that have worked there. And I think that, I know we've done it already in anticipation of it, and we really didn't get the first jingle in our pocket until April 17th to do it. But I think, like we didn't do back in the Reagan years, we've got to cut spending across the board, and you're never going to do it by asking others to do it and you want your pet project saved. But I think enterprisers, entrepreneurs, it's up to us to make sure we take this opportunity and share it with our employees. And we intend to do it. I was out public 4 years ago when I got the Entrepreneur of the Year award in Dubois County, saw a few shoulders shrugged by other fellow business owners. But my business has always been about trying to help others in the community and letting people share in the success that I've been blessed with, and I intend to do it. President Trump set the stage with the tax cut, and I think it's incumbent upon all business owners to follow through.
Thank you, sir, for his last answer this evening. Todd Rokita.
Thank you, Jeff. Listen, the best way out of poverty is a job. The worst way out of poverty is to be dependent on a government program. And that's all the Democrats are about. We want people to have the dignity of work. And there is dignity with work. There is something to be said for earning your success, because that yields happiness. President Trump's tax cuts are exactly what we need, and I was happy and proud to help write them and get them passed into law. That helps the least among us first. It's for middle class and lower class workers who have a job, who have that dignity of work. What you can't do is raise the gas tax. And that's exactly what was done, because that hurts the least among us worse. It makes it harder to get to a job. But that's what Mike Braun did. And 45 other taxes and fees on small business owners, on individuals. You can't do those kinds of things and expect to lift people out of poverty. And that's why, as I said from the beginning, we don't have a revenue problem, ladies and gentlemen. We have a spending problem. And real leadership shows us ways to get that curb, to live within our means, not to take more from us.
Thank you, sir. And finally.
Well, I appreciate the question. I can tell you, as a kid that grew up with a single-parent mom who worked at the factory, what folks care about is stagnant wages, not necessarily what somebody else is making. How do they get real growth and opportunity in their own life? I think that's why liberals are so afraid of this president, because he is waking up working people all across this country to the failed policies of the left and the fact that they're not making their life better. This is a case we're going to have to take to Joe Donnelly this fall, because Joe Donnelly's not who he says he is. He says he's conservative back home in Indiana, and then he votes with all those liberal policies that are failing working people when he's in Washington. My sense as I travel this state is Hoosier Republicans are trying to get this right. Who's the best person to take the case to Joe Donnelly? Mike Braun says often we got to change the dynamic, shake it up. Well, friends, can we trust a lifetime Democrat to shake us up? That would be really changing the dynamic for Indiana Republicans. Todd Rokita says he's with President Trump, but the reality is again and again and again he's not there. President Trump even told him to take down his advertisements that were faking President Trump's
Trump and
support.
I talk a lot, and we're not talking about
And
yard
he
signs,
can
Luke.
yell over my answers all he wants. That's the truth. And why he's yelling over the answers is because he doesn't like the truth.
Go to
I am who I say I am. I'm Luke Messer. I'm a pro-life, pro-Second Amendment conservative who supports President Trump, and we're going to take the case to Joe Donnelly this fall. Thank you.
For my part, let me say that I very much appreciate Steve Shine and the Allen County Republican Party for once again allowing me to play part with what I consider the crown jewel of Republicans in the state of Indiana, and that in fact is the Allen County Republican Party. I'm very glad to do that. Let me say to the three gentlemen, and I use that term, look, I get it. When you're in the boxing ring, there's a strong desire to throw a punch, and when one lands on you, it doesn't feel good. I get it, but I will say this. I think for the subjects that we've had to cover tonight, we probably heard more substance tonight than I've heard out of any of the three of you for a very long time. Civil for the most part, and I appreciate that. I would like for you, if you would, before we turn it back to Brian to dismiss us, if you'd show your appreciation for these three gentlemen, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.